Welcome back to the Daily Bible Breakdown. Today we're going to be covering Leviticus chapters 4 through 7. And that's a pretty good amount of reading to do in one day. But topically, it's important that we keep all these chapters together. So maybe you'll have to break up your reading a little bit throughout the day. But if you can get through it, it's all dealing with the same basic concept. So when we get to Leviticus chapter 4, we are introduced to another one of the offerings. This is called the sin offering. And this sacrifice seems to be intended for those who have sinned somehow unintentionally. When you read chapter 4, that's kind of the description that you get. Someone who sins out of ignorance. It wasn't an intentional or malicious act necessarily. And the type of sacrifice was actually going to be dependent upon the status of the offender. Meaning there were different sacrifices if you were a priest, a different sacrifice for just the Israelites as a community, a different sacrifice for rulers, and a different sacrifice for the common man, showing that there are differing levels of accountability. This was the most important offering, and it was always to be offered first. And if a priest sinned or if the whole community sinned, a bull had to be sacrificed and its blood taken inside the tabernacle and then sprinkled in front of the inner curtain. The fat, the kidneys, the covering of the liver, all that was to be burned on the altar of burnt offering. And the rest of the bull was taken outside the camp and burned, and none of it was to be eaten. It's very intriguing to see that Christ's death is compared to this particular sacrifice in Hebrews chapter 13. Remember, all these sacrifices are pointing to him. But in Hebrews 13 verses 11 and 12, it specifically talks about this type of offering that happened outside of the camp and how Christ's death was very similar to that. In chapters 5 through 7, we now see what we would call the guilt offering, along with some additional explanations. This is very similar to the sin offering, but it had to do with those sins that were against the things of the Lord, as it's put. And it was supposed to be accompanied by an additional payment of 20%, which would make up for the offense. And the offenses were probably along the lines of withholding the tithe, something that had specifically to do with their religious obligations. It was required when restitution was possible after another person had been wronged in one way or another. Someone who was guilty of theft or extortion would have to return what was taken and then also add that additional penalty of 20%. And if the person that they wronged or their close relative was no longer alive, then the total amount was then to be given to the priest. To acknowledge their guilt, the offerer had to offer a ram, and all but the fat belonged to the priest and his sons. And once again, we find that Christ's death is related to this offering, this guilt offering. And that reference is in Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 10. Throughout chapters 6 and 7, we're going to find that these sacrifices are repeated with some additional instruction and some regulation as to how they're to be presented to the Lord. And once again, the minute detail that's given here gives us a little more insight into the perfection and holiness of God and how specific He was as to how these sacrifices were to be carried out. Well, that's all the time we have for today's Daily Bible Breakdown. We'll see you in the next episode.